I named this talk Craving to Mosaic because when I mosaic, I play the same music over and over. And on my last work, which I'll show you here at the end of my show, I listened to one song probably hundreds of times, so much so, and it was called Craving You. I was going to actually incorporate it into my talk somehow, and I never quite got it together, but I left the title, Craving to Mosaic, because I crave to mosaic, like many of you do too. You can probably relate to that. Oh, a little bit too fast. There you go. This is the image taken of me during when I was in Australia, doing a number of different workshops. And in that song, Craving You by Thomas Rhett, he talks about a cigarette, like that cigarette, that shot of 100 proof. No matter how much I get, I'm always craving you. And then there's other lines or verses in the song that relate very much to the idea of craving something. It's really about a lady, but you can crave your mosaics too. I'm never quite getting enough of it. So just as for me, what I'm going to be talking about, I'll talk a little bit about my education. And then I'll be spending most of my time talking about things that inspire me and showing you my works. Some of the challenges that I meet for myself and some of the things I caused. Maybe a few of the stories. These are the things my wife told me not to do too much. I'll talk briefly about a couple of the residencies I did and how that resulted in different works. And then I'll finish off just to talk about my workshops really briefly. And while I'm thinking of it, I want to mention that my workshop tomorrow says in the write-up that you will not be taking home a mosaic. I thought it was kind of silly to think that you can make a mosaic and that's worthwhile in 6 hours total, but then I rethought it, and people are welcome if you take my workshop. If you didn't take it because you wouldn't be able to make a mosaic, you might want to reconsider. So, moving on. Also, I don't mind if people have questions as I go, but otherwise we'll just hold off to the end if there's any time left. In terms of my education, I studied forestry. I got a BS in forestry, and then in grad school I studied fire ecology. And that love for fire ecology has traveled with me over the years, although I don't do anything with fire ecology anymore. But you'll see in my works, if you're familiar with my works already, you know that I deal with fire. And it's a very topical conversation to be having. I know that there were fires in Germany and Sweden and Portugal and Greece is a big one in the news, and in the States we have fires all the time. This was a very, very bad year. In my hometown, I live in a valley that was covered in smoke for 5 or 6 weeks this year, and people were walking around with masks on their face. So it's a timely issue. It's an issue that we're going to be facing more and more with climate change, global warming, and you'll see that a lot of my works, most of my works deal with environmental issues like climate change. And so fire and water fit into those topics. After I studied fire ecology, I switched gears and studied molecular genetics. And my specialty was, I no longer do this, was plant developmental genetics. I studied mutants. I looked for genes that controlled plant identity, how a leaf can become a petal, and so forth. And then it ultimately led into kind of a down the spiral path into something really obscure, into the evolution of of flowers. And Darwin called it abominable mystery, how flowering plants came to be. And so I kind of fell down that hole, and then after a while I said, this isn't where I want to go anymore. When I turned 55, I decided I'm going to do what I want to do. And so that was like 9 years ago. And since that time, I started mosaics and somehow got to where I am today. These are 2 works that I did early on years ago, many years ago. These are acrylic paintings, and this one on the right was one that I did for my wife before we were married 37 years ago. And I carried it around me rolled up into a tube until last year, actually. I never quite finished it. It needed to be glazed. And because I was working with glass and had this sheet of glass there, I glazed it. I put it actually behind this large sheet of glass. The glass itself, you could see it's yellow and orange because all around the border, it's white underneath, so you can see the color of the glass itself. So it glazed that bird like I wanted it to. It looks like originally it was taken from a photo that was in the evening, but since that time I decided no, it's really a bird looking at fire. We can change our minds what things mean. These are examples of my first works. In 2007, I did that #1 leaf up in the corner. 2 Saturday morning classes, we finished it, and I decided this is what I'm going to do for fun. I did a little bit of painting, like I just showed you. I did some tile work, which I wasn't happy with, and so when I did this first work, I was hooked. And here's my second work. I was also interested in ancient Mexican motifs just for the design patterns, and so this flower arrangement up here, here's a flower with seeds below it and another flower with seeds, and I did this for my daughter's wedding. This was a direct technique. This was an indirect technique. I said, well, I'll just put it onto contact paper and turn it over, and it worked really well for me. Here's another ancient Mexican motif, this heron, and then I said, well, I'm going to start doing signs, address signs, and maybe my neighbors will say, hey, will you make one for me, and maybe I could quit my job at the university and do something I'm better suited for. This sign no longer, well, actually it's in my garage now, because I use weld bond. It's PVA, it's water soluble, and so, yeah, I'm glad I didn't make them for my neighbors. This is where I was at. I did these sort of things. They were my craftsy, I guess you would call them. And then in 2009, I got a hold of a poster of Van Gogh's, and I said, I'm going to mosaic that. And it's probably 2 by 3 feet, about that big. And I did it in indirect technique, and as a result, it is mirrored of the original Van Gogh. And it took me over a year to do this mosaic for a lot of reasons, but the main reason being I didn't really know what I was doing. I had it on contact paper, and after a few months, the contact paper wasn't sticky anymore, so things would move around. And I was well into this project before I actually got a black and white photo, which I always have now. And I could see that things I had moved major, like whole flowers had moved over. And not that it really mattered, but I wanted to follow what I had in front of me. So, and also I did it in my garage, unfinished garage in a snow country, so it got very cold. I would be shaking sometimes while I worked, but anyway, it took me over a year. But when I finished it, I felt I learned an awful lot because I did things over and over. I felt I learned a lot from Van Gogh. Because when you look down at the very details of how he managed to make things stand out, it was very informative for me, and so I carry some of those things on in my current work. I like to go to garage sales, or garbage sales I call them sometimes, where people want to sell the things that they don't want anymore. And I found this frame, empty frame, gold frame. I said, I'm going to find an image of my own that I can mosaic, and I'm going to put it into that frame. That was the mosaic I did. This is called Radiance. It's called Radiance because #1, the light. #2, because I was a developmental biologist. In my head, I always think about bilateral symmetry and radial symmetry and asymmetry. And this is a great example of radial symmetry, not only in the flower petals, how they're arranged on each flower, but the actual arrangement of the flowers here in this circle. So I didn't say this, but I did. But this is based on a photo I took. So I didn't concoct anything, so it had this nice circle here. So I thought, okay, this is Radiance. That's what I called it. And a mentor of mine, not at the time, but some of you may know her, Lillian Brokaw, said when she first saw it in the frame when it was on exhibit, she said, John, get rid of that frame. I thought, oh my God. And this was at the conference where I had taken Best of Show. I thought, oh, well. Oliver Budd, some of you may know him, past president of BAMM, during the conversation about the exhibit to the full forum, said, praised the work and said, but get rid of that frame. So that was kind of put something in my head, and I still kind of work with that today. I didn't really have an idea how mosaics was different than painting, and obviously if I put into a frame that looks like it's for paintings, I'm kind of saying it's more painting and not very mosaic-like. So offended some people. I thought it was good advice. And so this is the work. I actually ended up putting into another frame that was also probably unsuitable, but there it is. There it is. When I had my colleagues in the biology department look at this, when I was trying to say, oh, I should do this instead of my science because I can make it fit somehow, An entomologist friend of mine looked at it and goes, "Whoa, there's a praying mantis." And I also knew that there was a butterfly. The butterfly was a mistake. By doing the indirect method, if you use stained glass, sometimes one side is different from the other side. And it was supposed to be yellow, and it was brown, and it came out, but it looks like a butterfly. So I said, okay, I did a butterfly. But I didn't intend to make anything that looked like a praying mantis. And up close like this, it doesn't look like much of anything, but he saw it, and so I didn't want to argue. All my works, that was more related to my biology. Now, most of my works now are somewhat related to more environmental concerns. This is a forget-me-not. I believe it probably grows in Britain, some places. It's a small flower, you may be familiar with it. The whole plant may grow this big or this big, and the flowers themselves are tiny little pin blue wheels. It's a lovely little plant, but when you compare it to the rest of the environment, it's really hard to see. It's down low, it doesn't have big showy flowers. And so I wanted to emphasize the idea that even if organisms aren't important to us for use, we can't eat it, we can't make cloth out of it, etc., that they still have a place in our environment. And so this is Forget-Me-Not for Love Alone is the title of it. The background is bold, and it fights for attention from that Forget-Me-Not, and it's also true for the frame. But it's competing for attention with this lovely little flower. So that was the idea. This was the first work that I actually put my mosaics directly onto a sheet of glass as a new way of framing. And actually, since this time, this is the only way I frame my works. So this mosaic was transferred directly onto this sheet of glass that has a cement backer board behind it with the hanging mechanisms. This is a little bit earlier work, doing my fluid double reverse technique. And the fluid part comes into the fact that I do no gluing or adhering until the mosaic is finished, which that sounds kind of weird to a lot of people. Basically what I do is over my image, I lay my tesserae, and because they're not glued, I can change them however I want, and I do bump them, but every time I make a mistake or change things, I tell myself it's going to be better next time. Like when I fix it up. And I've gotten a lot better at not wearing long sleeves that rake across the work or dropping things right onto it. So I've gotten some better habits now. But, so when I did this work, I was nearly finished, and I'm kind of a little kid sometimes. I wanted my wife to look, Mommy, look what I did. And so she came into the studio and was over there, and I wanted her to see it, so I just put it on the floor, which I often do so I could get distance from it. And it was upside down for me, so she was over there, so I stepped over it and I kicked it. And my wife turned around and went into the house. She thought I would be furious, and I wasn't, but I probably could have been. Well, all the pieces are still there, but so it was a matter of tidying it up a bit. And in the very middle is the part that was still left a little bit scattered. You might not be able to see that, but I can see it. I decided to call it a stir because it was at this time that in the Gulf Coast of in the Gulf of Texas, in the sea, I can't say it, there was an oil spill. You may or may not have known about it, but that was making the headline news. I happened to be in Lhasa National Park at that time where I took this photo, and I know that the things that happen in one place of the world are going to affect things in the other part of the world, and this park, which seems quite pristine, is actually undergoing lots of changes because of people. And so you can't see it here, but in the mosaic itself, some of the white tesserae in the sky are iridized glass, so that it looks like oil and water. So that's pretty subtle. Then I put birds in the sky and then called it a stir, just because things are stirred up. This was taken from another image from that same setting over on the left, just a little bit more tame. I wanted to bring the colors down just a bit. And at this time, I didn't really know that mosaics tend to be square, or the tesserae. And so I found one and I said, this is the ode to the square tesserae. If you've been watching all along, my tesserae are different sizes, different shapes. And yeah, some squares are okay too. This is of Eden. This is where I was continuing doing works that had environmental issues. This is a Shasta daisy. Shasta daisies are triple hybrids produced, I forgot by whom, in 1890s in the States. and it's super vigorous. Anybody have it in their gardens? It's a great plant. It's hard to get rid of. This was by the fire pit. I have a cabin in the mountains, and it was growing by it. So I took, oh, these are beautiful. I took a picture, and that's when I realized that actually these are naturalized aliens, exotic species. So it was a little bit disappointing, but there are lots of naturalized plants and animals as a result of people. I still liked it anyway. It's got a few things going on, but I just want to kind of point out that it has a full range of developmental biologists, from the opening flower to the senescing flower over here. This is the first work I actually did my technique, my fluid double reverse technique. And just to explain it real quick here, then I'll have you do this. If this is my working panel and my image is on top of this, this is where I put my tesserae. And then when I'm finished, I flip it, and then on another panel, I butter it with adhesive, not with this, and put it on the back side of that mosaic and flip it back. So it's fluid because the pieces aren't glued yet when I first build it, and then I flip it once and I flip it back. So it's a double reverse. In the end, I built it the way I want to see it. I don't have the problems of the glass being different, and then remember to put the side I want to see down, which you have to do for the indirect method. Let's see, so this was a challenge to myself to do an abstract. If you're familiar with my work, you know that I don't do abstracts, but if you look closely at my work, there are often areas that are very abstract. You might say messy. And so this is one of the mosaics that my wife has a hard time seeing, even to this day. It's hanging on our wall. But in different audiences, I get different responses. I'm going to ask you guys just to pick 1, 2, 3, or 4 as the correct orientation, or the intended orientation of this mosaic. I showed this to a group of park rangers, and every one of them knew exactly which one. I was surprised. But most audiences, it's about a quarter each of the 4 choices. So hopefully you're ready to go. And I'll have a show of hands. How many people think 1? Okay, good number. 2. Okay, a few less. 3. That lady. Okay, and 4. Wow, most of you got it. There you go. I call this old growth partly because it's meant to represent the base of a large tree, a western red cedar, and then it's also the ground where you have the forest litter, the leaves and the needles. And the real old growth for this was the lichens and moss. This is a mosaic that I've got a lot of attention with this mosaic. I call it Snowfell. It's based off a photo I took not too far from that last image. And I didn't really know where I got this photo a few years before. Like, where did this come from? And I kind of forgot about it. When I was working on it, this tree right here up close had Christmas lights on it. I go, that's from the deck of my house, and this is the driveway going up. So it was kind of strange to belatedly figure out where I got it from. It was very complicated work to do. A lot of people were surprised that I could actually carry it off. And some of the ways I was able to do it, I don't think I have a close-up of it, no. If you were able to see this close-up, you'd see that it's really a mess. I don't pay attention to ornamento whatsoever. But some of the pieces I put on their ends, sideways like this, they had to be cut very short because they have lines in them. And by doing that, I was able to get some of the complexities that are going on, like in these regions here, which otherwise would have been just a big mess. This got locked up in the Henry Ford Museum, a presidential museum, I think it was 2014, when the federal government in the U.S. had a shutdown, and I was taking this by hand to Ravenna for an exhibit there, and so I stopped at the museum to pick it up, and they were closed. And so, like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And so I walked around the building a few times, and finally a custodian came out and said, are you John? I said, yeah. The curator there had warned him that I might be showing up to pick it up. So anyway, I was able to pick it up and take it to Ravenna. In Ravenna, I still was having problems with people with my framing, and Sonia King, some of you may know her, came across and said, you hit it. So most of my mosaics now are on this kind of a black sheet. This is based off a photo that I took on my property in Oregon. And it was during the smell melt. It was in March, so there was big piles of snow still melting in this oak savanna. And this is at, let's see, 1,200 meters elevation. So it's not, we get snow and then it melts. And I did this after doing the snowfell because snowfell was based on a photo I took years ago where we used to get 2 feet, 2/3 of a liter or a meter accumulating during the winter, and now we get hardly any. So things are warming up a bit. And so I decided to contrast the snow accumulation with the snow melt and sort of make a story about it. I was almost finished with it when I decided, well, I need something a little bit more. I'm not really big at having a subject. You might notice in my images I don't have a bird or animal somewhere typically. And I decided, because I was familiar with Claude Monet's work, that I would put in a magpie because it's the, yeah. So I was familiar with this painting. Here's the snow scene, there's the magpie. And so I took that magpie and put it on that fence. And so I called this Monet's magpie. And let's see, you can see again up close like this, you can see I use very strange pieces, large ones, small ones, big ones, little ones.
How big is that work? Okay.
It's now in the Gaziantep Museum in Turkey. They have if anybody's ever had a chance to go there, if things ever settle down a little bit, it's a massive, massive museum of mosaics, Roman mosaics, on the floors, right next to each other and on the walls. And they're building a wing of contemporary mosaics, and so they paid my way to go there. So that was the cost. And so being back at the university, I had to justify the sort of things I'm doing, and so I kind of put these together into this idea. This was a poster I did at the university once, just to kind of put them together, and yeah. It was based on that work that I was successful in getting a residency at Crater Lake National Park, and that's only 2 hours away from my home. I was given this cabin here, this stone house actually, and it was based right down there where the arrowhead is. And so I was outside the lake, and the reason I'm pointing that out is because this wall right here of the caldera, I'll be pointing that back out later in a bit. So that's where I was situated. And I never did see a fire there, although there were a couple going on at the time. But I did see a thunderstorm moving in, and this is based off a photo that I took of that storm moving in. Another commonality that you may have noticed is that I tend to have crows. I don't think that's from Van Gogh, but there it is. When I was there, I did see lots of dead and dying trees. It's a very overgrown forest. When Europeans came in the 1850s, they burned the hell out of it. And this is what came back in, pioneer species that are now very old and dying. And this whole area is going to blow up at some point. And here's a huge fire scar on a ponderosa pine, just to give you an idea what fires can do. And so here's that caldera wall that I pointed to a minute ago in the image of Crater Lake. I was down in a bit of a valley, so I was in the shadow, like these trees in the foreground. And then this is the caldera wall behind that was orange because the sun was setting behind me. And so it made it look orange. I thought, wow, that looks like a fire. And so I call it foreshadow because the trees in the front and the foreground are in shadow, but it's also foreshadowing fire. And so we have dead trees, and then big dead trees, and then fire ladders. These are trees that don't mind shade, and because they keep their limbs down low to the ground, fire is able to go from them up into the stands of the larger trees. So it's not a good situation. You may or may not be familiar with Smokey the Bear. Is that something you ever hear here? Yeah. He's cute and cuddly. I think he's been there since the 30s, maybe before, I'm not sure. In an attempt to protect our forests as a resource, and the idea was that fires are bad. Not even if people aren't supposed to cause them, those are bad. But fires got a bad rap, just like wolves. And so every fire, and it still happens, almost every fire that happens in the States gets put out. And so what's the result when you have an environment that's burned for eons or for millennia, and now you stop the fires from occurring. Well, if you walk in the forest around there, they feel like a mattress because the fuel load is just building up like crazy. So this is really this wrong signal to be given to people. And this was my replacement for Smokey. And I offered it to the park rangers, and they didn't bat an eye, they didn't make any comment whatsoever. I made up a story about this forest gin because I studied forest ecology. I knew that fire really was a regenerative force, and so this is a forest gin who was making use of the fire to regenerate the forest, basically. That was the one on the left. The one on the right actually is what I call firefighting. This is the idea of sometimes we do need to fight those fires. When I was working on the one on the left in my studio, I think she must have been 12-year-old granddaughter walked by one day and said, "Oh, what are you doing?" And she was okay with it. And I was hanging on the wall, and I was working on the second one, and she came by, this is probably a year and a half later, and looked at it and said, "Do you mean it's a friend of mine. He took his clothes off, and you took a picture of him?" I thought we already went through this, but yeah, anyway, it's been sort of exciting. Back to the water theme. I think I'm getting close to being finished. And how am I doing on time? Okay?
Yeah.
Sometimes I need that shepherd's hook to pull me off. So this is an attempt also. I'm trying to do fire and water together. I wasn't sure I was able to do, but I felt pretty successful that this does look like water. It's on I call it brookside. It's on a very small brook, and looks pretty complicated. Another water image. I did this work while I did an artist residency at Uralboro's Glass. Anybody ever heard of them? They no longer exist, but their line of glass is still being produced elsewhere. But while I was there, I knew I only had 2 weeks to do something, and I take so long. I take months. Sometimes I do only one work a year. So in 2 weeks, okay, what am I going to do? And it's all Uralboro's glass. I decided to do this image, and knowing that it's sort of abstract. And when I posted it online, I got a comment from my mentor and friend that, "John, there's just not enough contrast, not enough tonal contrast." And it was something that I knew myself. I was kind of lamenting, "Oh, I really screwed up on this one. It doesn't have enough contrast." And so, because of Lillian, or not because of Lillian, she kind of confirmed what I already knew. I added some more leaves. This leaf, this leaf, this leaf, and this one are actually real leaves. I was going to go back into the workshop and carve some out like I did down here, only I wanted bigger ones because I want to give the sense of depth. I don't know if anybody ever gets that, but a larger leaf and then falling down to this is a stream. The whole thing's a stream, and with reflecting the fall foliage in it, and it got pretty complicated. This is actually a rock underneath the water, so I was trying to do reflecting on top of the water like Monet did, and then actually into the water depths itself. So it was quite a challenge. So I made it black and white just for you to see that it turns out okay. It's not the best tonal contrast, but I also realized that part of the problem with the original image was the photography. So there's so much you can do to fix things up, to make them look better. Anyway. Okay, this is my last work that I'm going to show you. I call it Chiaroscuro because of that last comment, I wanted to really push the dark and the light. And this is in Oak Savannah in the same area as all of my other images were taken. And I don't think I have a whole lot to say about it. Somebody noticed online that there's a little bit of blue sky up there. And just to switch gears now to talk about workshops. I've taught at the university for many years now, and one thing that's consistent is that students don't change. And it doesn't matter how old students are. And so when I started doing the workshops 3 years ago, I found the older students, older than my 18 to 22-year-olds, are the same kind of people. They're just older. And so there's people who don't believe, and people who text when they should be listening. A lot of people work very hard, like this group in the middle, and my techniques give people headaches sometimes. I love working with people. This is just a small sample of some of the works they're able to do. Quite surprising sometimes. I think it surprises them as well. And my hosts, This is just three of my hosts, and Sabelle, and Sophia, and Suze, and she was live. And then this is my last slide. I'd like to finish off saying that I'm not sure where I would be today if it weren't for this organization, CMA, Contemporary Mosaic Art, and Pam Gibbons, who founded it. It's her website, but it's an organization, some of you I know are members in it, where it's all mosaics, and there's all kinds of different areas in it for helping. And it's from this website that I really got to be where I am today. I might be still in my garage doing my own thing, if not for CMA and Pam. And so if there's time, I'm not sure if you have questions, I'll be glad to hear them.